Welcome back to Your Average Witch, where every Tuesday we talk about witch life, witch stories, and sometimes a little witchcraft. Your Average Witch is brought to you by Clever Kim's Curios. In this episode, I'm talking to David Davis of Porous Palms. David tells us about visions, spirits, communion, and how the Exorcist was not allowed in his home as a child. Now let's get to the stories. Hi, David. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. Can you please introduce yourself and let everybody know who you are and what you do and where they can find you?
Yes, absolutely. So my name is David Davis. I use he, him pronouns. I am on Instagram and Twitter. I prefer the Instagram because my Twitter I just talk a lot of mess on there. But Instagram at Porous Palms. So like Porous, Porous, and then palms is in the palm of your hand. Um, I like to refer to myself as like the chief dirt whisperer of Porous Palms and Porous Palms Apothecary. I'm a folk mystic, sorcerer, artist, writer, etc. Um, yeah, so that's me.
Where did the name Porous Palms come from?
So it is a very clumsy way to sort of allude to like my hands-on approach to magic. I love getting my hands dirty. That's how I learn stuff. I'm a hands-on learner, and so it was like I said, a sort of a visually clumsy way for me to allude to like me absorbing information and experiences via my hands, if that makes any sense. And so that's where that comes from. It's probably not the most obvious way to get that point across, but it's stuck, and it has a charm to it.
I don't think it's clumsy, and I kind of thought that's what you were getting at, so it worked for me. I liked it.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you very much. I love
You are
alliteration. I have a background in
Oh
poetry,
my
so
gosh.
yeah, I love that.
Me too. That's why my shop name has all three hard K sounds at the beginning because,
Yeah.
well, yeah, because I just love sibilants and similar sounds. I'm a nerd.
Yeah.
What what does it mean to you when you call yourself a witch?
So, funny enough, magically speaking, I don't refer to myself as a witch. So, whenever I do align myself with that word, it's usually more from like an archetypal point of view. So, like the witch as the adversary, this like not quite human, almost animal being. Um, and listening, I sort of came to that conclusion a few years ago, or sort of aligned myself with that uh, viewpoint a few years ago, just from listening to a lot of like traditional witchcraft practitioners, that I met through social media, like Austin Fuller of Bane X Bramble being one of them. Like they really played a huge role, whether they know it or not. And me sort of forming this idea of what slash who, or rather who slash what a witch is. So like magically speaking, I don't refer to myself as a witch just for like cultural reasons. Um, and I really liked that approach to witchcraft and just like what a witch is, because it aligned with my sort of like anti-respectability sentiments on a lot of things. I'm really not too big on going out of my way to convince people that I'm not something. Um, and also just like if my enemies don't see me as like wicked or monstrous, and I feel like I'm doing something wrong, so I kind of want that sort of element to be a part of who I am and how I navigate the world and how I present myself. So yeah, for me, witch is more archetypal. Um, but yeah, like magically speaking, like I don't work with like witching spirits. I don't work with sort of like the folkloric devil, for example, or certain spirits. And like the elder tree being, like a witching spirit specifically. That's not something that's a part of my practice. And so, just out of respect for that tradition and that worldview, or rather those worldviews, because traditional witchcraft is so vast and broad. Um, I make that I like to make that personal distinction.
So you want your enemies to be uneasy when they think about you?
Yeah, like, like,
Me
because they're
too.
they're my enemies for a reason, right? Like, and not only,
Yes.
like, magical enemies, but also just, like, because also, like, the witch being, like, a political figure, right? The witch has always been this politicized thing, like, whether you're looking at it from a gendered perspective or, like, a queer perspective or, like, a racial perspective, or like an economic one as well, like a socioeconomic one. Like, I'm a marginalized person. I'm black and queer and working class, and we're in this world where fascism is on the rise, if not, or rather, it's already risen. And I want them to be afraid. I want the fascists to be afraid. And I want them to, see me as the monster or the devil or their antichrist, because that's my job. That's what I'm supposed to be to them. So yeah.
I like you already. What term would you prefer I use?
Like I
Uh,
use sorcerer,
okay.
mystic, like magically speaking. I tend to use. I've been sort of experimenting with sorcerer. It feels more in line with me than like magician. That has a very specific connotation to it. That I'm not
Black top
against,
hat.
but yeah, like top hat, and I'm just thinking like commanding the spirits into the circle and blah 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 blah. Like that feels very magician to me. Um, and so yeah, it's like sorcerer, mystic,
Okay.
those things feel. Conjurer is complicated, but yeah, sorcerer is good.
What about the practice itself? Was witchcraft okay?
Yeah, witchcraft is fine for the sake of conversation. I don't get like offended at being called a witch. Naturally, just social media tends to flatten a lot of things for simplicity's sake, and so like I get lumped in with witches a lot. I got sort of like my honorary invite to the Sabbath, but and I'm not opposed to that. I'll show up, but yeah, it's not offensive to me. It's just not something I would personally use. So use whatever word comes to mind. I'm aware of the name of the podcast, Your Average Witch. It's whatever. It's fine.
Okay. I had too much caffeine. I cannot focus on one thing because you just sent me on so many little mind journeys.
I had my first cup of coffee today after a week-long water fast, and I am in the fifth dimension right
Oh,
now. So it's
holy moly.
yeah.
Do you have any family history with witchcraft or practicing magic or any stories from childhood where even if your family would say absolutely not,
Mm.
there's still something kind of metaphysical happening?
Yeah, for sure. I grew up in church, Protestant, like sort of like a Protestant denomination. And, my dad is an ordained minister, and we went to the church that my grandmother still owns and preaches at. Um, and so I grew up around religion, but not this like, not to sort of, you know, dog on anyone else's experience, but it wasn't a very passive religious experience where I was like, all right, we go to church on Sunday and that's that. Like, it was so, this sort of spirituality and awareness of spirit was so deeply infused into my upbringing. Um, and obviously, for obvious reasons, maybe not so obvious, but for me, obvious reasons, I didn't enjoy growing up in church. But I'm grateful that I grew up in an environment where conversations about spirits and how they function were so commonplace. Spirits weren't just these like abstractions or metaphors. They were like these very real, tangible sort of things that were present in our daily lives. And it was nothing to hear like a super vivid description of a spirit. I remember I have two distinct memories of many. I forget the context of the sermon, but it was one that my dad was teaching and or sort of leading, and he was talking about the spirit of lust. and he went into like a visual description of it. He said it's this being that's covered in from head to toe in sexual organs, and it's in a constant state of pleasuring itself. And I'm a child at this point. We stopped going to church when I was 13, so any stories of church are like 13 and younger, so keep that in mind. Those are sort of like images I was raised with. um and then there was like another story. The church that we went to was, I grew up with a lot of like anti-Catholic sentiment, unfortunately, as one does in Protestant spaces. And the church is situated in Southwest Detroit, which has a very large like Mexican Catholic population. And so there was always a lot of like passive aggressive sort of commentary about the spirits of that area. And my grandmother referenced this demon that she saw with the snake of a tail, the tail of a snake, like its tail was a snake, and it was never ending. It was sort of like weaving its way through the neighborhood and wrapping its tail around the minds of the people there. Um, and I'm obviously not like super concerned about with whether or not these visions were real or whether or not these depictions weren't sort of colored in by dogma. I'm sure they were. I'm 99.999% sure they were colored in by a lot of dogma, and propaganda, if you will. But um, that vivid nature of those conversations really helped me not feel so self-conscious about my practice, and the fact that I do commune, and just that practitioners do commune so directly with spirits. And it's easy, especially in like this very materialist world that we're living in, to sort of feel like I said, a bit self-conscious about that. Like you don't want to seem too woo-woo or whatever. And it's like, no, yeah, like spirits are out there, and there's a spirit in everything. And I also talk about how church was the first time or the first space where I was taught animism, not by name, obviously, but I was taught that concept that everything has a spirit. We were going to Friday night prayer one time, and I wanted to wear a T-shirt that had the Carnage on it, the comic book character. And Carnage is not a very visually appealing character. If you're, for those who aren't familiar, it's this red monster. Sort of, it looks like they're sort of made of blood almost. They have sharp teeth and claws and whatever. They're a Spider-Man villain. And my dad was like, you can't wear that to church because that shirt has a spirit on it. Right, like that, the image looked demonic to him, and I'm like, "Well, you bought it, but whatever." The image had it looked demonic to him, and so he's like, "That has a spirit on it." And again, like dogma, but there was that idea that like, oh, this T-shirt, right, is capable of carrying something very real and alive. And a lot of this was through reflection. Um, I wasn't 8 years old, like, yes, animism. But, upon reflection, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what that was. And so a lot of my practice now is involves a lot of me going back to my churchy roots, the way I approach ritual, the way I approach spirit work. Um, yeah. So that's my history.
That story about the T-shirt really suddenly explains something. Me. I was in Germany. I lived in Germany for a while, and we were getting a tattoo, and one of the other customers came in, and he wanted, uh I don't think it was a demon, I think it was something from a, like, record, album art or something.
Hmm.
Had horns,
Yeah.
and the tattoo artist was refusing to do it because she said it was demonic, and she didn't want it in her shop.
Right.
I
Like the act of something just being in that space. Like, don't even bring that. We weren't allowed to watch The Exorcist growing up. Like, don't even
Good,
bring
because
that
that's
movie.
terrifying.
Yeah, I ended up watching it like later
Oh,
on, but
no.
like
Oh.
they were like, don't even press play on that movie in the house. Like that movie has a spirit in it. There's something. My parents like. There's something wrong with that movie. It's not just super scary because we loved horror movies. I grew up watching horror movies. Other possession movies. They weren't opposed to like demonic possession possession movies, but The Exorcist specifically, they were like, "Don't, nope, that cannot play in this house. There is something wrong with that movie." And I'm
Frankly, I
like,
agree.
"Wow." They were like, "Don't do it." And I'm like, "All right, like, yeah, sure."
I don't know why my mom had that on when I was, like, 6, but she did, and I agree
Yeah.
with your parents. Don't don't do that. I have not watched it since because it bothered me.
Yeah, it is unsettling. I'm not downplaying how unsettling it was, but yeah, it was just that yeah, that was my environment, and yeah.
For me, more than bringing it into the house, it's the understanding that something can invade me that is was so scary and
Yeah,
still is still scary.
yeah, yeah,
'Cause I
understandably.
hadn't thought about that as a kid before, and suddenly, whoa.
That was me with the idea of demonic possession didn't scare me as much as a kid, but, like, my similar experience was, like, Hellraiser, seeing Hellraiser for the first time, and I was a bit intrigued by that because that was the first time that I ever thought consciously about pain, and I was, like, single digits when I saw that movie, and so, like, that opening scene of, like, the hooks coming out of the box and piercing him, I was like, "That's the first time I ever thought about, like, the fact that I can hurt," if that makes any sense. That was really, like, a
Yeah.
very visceral experience for me, and it didn't scare me away from the movie. I It's one of my all-time favorite movies, um, but I had, like, a similar experience where it kind of shook your young brain a bit. It kinda rewired it for better or for
Mhm.
worse.
Yeah. Yeah, that part still makes me cringe.
Yeah, you're like, "Ooh, that's ugh," just you wince a little, like, "Oh,
Yeah.
goodness."
So let's talk about your practice a little bit if we
Mhm.
can. Can you introduce us to it? Do you have any daily or consistent anything that you do? I
Yeah, so
hesitate to use the word ritual really, but
yeah. I refer to my practice as, like, culturally hoodoo. Um, Again, like, growing up in church, it was a, a Black church. My grandmother is from Mississippi, I believe, and she comes from, like, minister her dad was a minister, and so there's that history of hoodoo sort of coming out of the Black church in the South specifically. Um, and so, like, I refer to my practice as culturally hoodoo, so it informs, again, like, my approach to ritual, my sort of bits and pieces of my personal cosmology, my relationship to ancestors and community. I do a lot of ancestor veneration. That's a huge part of my, like, regular work, if not daily, definitely regular. Um, the music I listen to, the foods I eat, all that stuff, the certain superstitions I may have, quote unquote superstitions, but magically, as far as, like, spell work, ritual work that I do on a regular basis, on a more regular basis, it's more of like a general North American folk magic approach to things, which encompasses hoodoo because hoodoo is a part of that larger sort of it's under that North American folk magic umbrella, but I also pull from just other traditions, right? Like, again, like the traditional witchcraft spaces, even if I'm not working with the spirits per se of a specific tradcraft practice, I'm picking up on, like, certain rituals and certain sort of metaphysical concepts of how different things work and how to approach different types of spirits. Um, I like to sort of folkify grimoires a lot, which is not, that's not original to me. That's a sort of an established part of North American folk magic. You see, like, the Key of Solomon being used a lot. Um, I like the Picatrix, other, books that I can't think of off the top of my head, but those are, like, the big two for me. So that's what it looks like for me. A lot of divination, predictive divination. I love a good journal prompt tarot pull as much as the next person, but, like, I also want to know whether or not I'm going to get that job or whether or not this thing is going to happen or not happen. And so, like, divination for me is a big regular practice. And, like I said, ancestor veneration, you know, I love mundane acts as ritual. So, like, cleaning your home is a spiritual act, right? Like, cleaning specific parts of your home, right? Cleaning your laundry, your bed sheets, what's good, taking that spiritual bath, and you're like, I removed all the blockages, but I'm going to put on these dirty clothes and lay down on my dirty sheets. Like, okay, well, like, like that, you kind of, canceled it out as far as I'm concerned. And so, um, yeah, that's kind of like what my work looks like on a regular basis. It's very, um, like urban homesteady. That's that's kind of like what it looks like in a lot of most often.
How would you say that your practice has changed your life? Or would you? Because it seems like your practice began well into your young life.
Mm. Yeah, it so I've been practicing and studying magic for like a decade now, and I'm 26 for reference. Um, and so like high school, I would say I really started being intentional about, um, I cast my first real spell, quote unquote, real spell in high school. Um, it was a love spell, shocker. And so that
In high school, aren't they all?
right, it was very much like rubbing cinnamon on a picture of this person and like binding our pictures together with red thread. I'm glad it didn't work because you know, they're them. But you're in high school and you're like, "Oh, I have a crush." And so that was that. Um, it has changed my life. It has provided a very like specific way to see the world and interact with it. It's deeply fulfilling for me to be able to look at the things around me and know that they aren't inanimate or like without intelligence, whatever that word means to whoever's listening. um I love the fact that even if I'm not actively doing, quote unquote, doing magic, that like that tree I walk past or that bird I just saw fly over me or that lake behind my building, it's alive, right? There are spirits, there is a spirit of that thing, and there are also spirits in that thing. Um, and that's just really like I said, fulfilling for me. I said earlier, I refer to myself as a mystic as well, and I really seek those mystical experiences. I love communion with spirit, even if there's not like a result that I'm looking for, something that I'm trying to make happen, or petition them for. Sometimes I just like to be in their presence, right? Call them into my space and just feel them on a sensory level. My practice is very sensual in that way. And then also, just full disclosure, there's that element of power. I like being able to like do shit and make stuff happen, and that just feels good to me. Um, yeah, I like that. It's kind of addictive.
Yeah.
Like I'm not gonna pretend like I'm just above that. No,
It's
I'm
all
not.
about it's
Yeah,
all about being one with the universe.
yeah, like yeah.
What would you say is the biggest motivator for you in your practice? And has it changed since you first started out?
I would say it hasn't changed, and it's communion, like I mentioned just now. Result-oriented magic aside, and there's definitely a place for that in my work, in my regular work. But just I just like at the end of the day, I just like experiencing spirits. Um, I like smelling them and tasting them and feeling them and hearing them. I don't like seeing them, but I like experiencing them with four of my five senses. And there is, to me, that's where the sort of deeper work is, and I don't mean deeper in sort of like a hierarchical way, like it's better or more profound than results oriented magic, but it's just what gets me out of bed in the morning. um Being able to experience spirits, just as they are with no pretense or expectation. And I refer to myself as a mystic before I refer to myself as a practitioner of anything specific. Um, yeah, and so that's been me for the past like 5 or 6 years. That's been my main driver.
Okay, I gotta ask,
Hmm.
the taste thing.
Hmm.
I am I don't know what it is about me personally, but I have little interaction with or relationship with what I understand spirits to be.
Hmm.
I mean, maybe they are and I'm just oblivious. But anyway, what do they each taste different, or is there a specific taste that you get when you are interacting?
So it's something that I will induce on my end, right? So all of those senses are things that I will induce on my end, right? So I work with materials. Materials are very important to me, and I work. A lot of my work is planetary in nature, and so I don't work with the physical planets. I'm not an astrologer, but I do work within the planetary currents, right? And so each planet has different herbs, materials, sounds, smells, etc., that are associated with them or that they rule over. And so, for example, I work with Mars a lot, right? And so Mars, very spicy, right? It's dry. Like I said, it's hot, kind of bitter sometimes, right? And so, like if I want to induce a martial experience to sort of get myself into that headspace, I might burn some like dragon's blood and ginger. I might, um, sort of put like a pinch of like cinnamon powder on my tongue and sort of like swish that around in my mouth with like some fireball whiskey, to sort of warm up my body. Um, and so that's what it is. It's induced on my end. It's not necessarily it's not that this has never happened, but it's not that I'm like I wake up out of my sleep and I'm like I smell, roses all of a sudden. It's like okay, I want to sort of commune with that Venusian current, so I am going to expose myself to the smell of roses, if that makes any sense.
Okay, I'm freaking out and excited. This might change things for me. Holy okay, okay, I'm excited, but I cannot focus on that right now. Do you ever experience self-doubt about your practice or in this area of your life? And if you do, how do you beat it or move past it?
Sometimes, though, the way I tend to beat that sort of like imposter syndrome is finding what you're first of all, turn off your phone, okay? Because like looking at, and I'm 26, and I try not to sound like I firmly believe that social media makes time move faster. So that like I'm 26 years old and I already feel out of touch with people who are like 20, which is not which I feel like is unprecedented. Like generations used to feel longer if I'm
Yeah,
correct.
that makes
Um,
super sense.
and I'm like, why do I have nothing in common with this 21-year-old when we should have more in common as far as like socially, as far as like social stuff is concerned. Um, but saying all that to say this, like put down your phone because looking at social media and what other people are doing is only going to make you feel like you're not doing enough. And this isn't to knock what anyone else is doing. I'm a business owner on social media. I get the need for aesthetics and to sort of post content and to sort of be active. But I will also be the first to tell you that like sometimes for the sake of an image, you'll set something up. You'll light those candles for that picture.
Absolutely.
Right. And so it's not like if I'm posting a picture of like some ritual set up every day, it's not because I'm doing ritual every day. It's because I set that up. It's a photo shoot, right? Like I
Because the
needed to post up.
algorithm.
Yeah, it's a photo shoot. And yes, it might have been set up with intention, sure, but like it's not a conjuration you're looking at, right? And so that is put that down, or if you're going to sink into social media, do so with that understanding in mind. Also, look at find out what you're good at or want to be good at, um, get even better at it, and then do it as much as possible to like solidify that knowing that you're actually good at it, right? So for me, like writing, I've always loved writing. Um, and I've always loved to write. And I've spent so much time honing that craft that I know for a fact I'm a good writer. If someone came up to me right now and said, David, you're a bad writer, I'd say you're a liar. You don't have to like it. Like, that's valid. You don't have to like my work, but you cannot tell me that I'm bad at this. Right. And maybe that's just like my Leo nature. Um just being like, you can't tell me anything. But there are certain things that you can tell me, David, you're not very good at that, right? Like if I try to go join a I don't know, a breakdancing league, right? I would not be very good at that. And someone would be able to tell me, I don't even know if that's a thing, but anyways, someone would be able to tell me, hey, David, you're not good at this. And I'm like, you're right. Right. And I might feel a bit self conscious in that space because I know that's not my thing. But, you sit me down in a creative writing class, I'm like, oh, I got this. Right? And so I feel like that's how I've worked through different things, right? If I want to get better at reading tarot, I read tarot more, right? I read books on it. I watch the YouTube videos. I take notes. I pick up different interpretations of different cards that, some of my favorite readers on social media, for example, may choose to share with the public, or with me personally, like if I reach out to them privately. So yeah, just find what you're good at or you want to be good at, and then just do it as much as possible until you're even better at it, and then just keep doing it. And it's not it's a never ending journey, and that's the fun part.
For talking about imposter syndrome, that was so positive. I feel uplifted, and instead
I'm
of
glad.
how I usually feel, which is, "Oh, crap."
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to have, Leo, I tend to have a bit of a, yeah, that's I like that effect.
Me too.
Yeah.
What would you say is your biggest struggle when it comes to your practice or your work?
Keeping it simple, keeping things simple. So I'm a Leo Virgo.
Oh
Um,
gosh.
yeah, and so like the Leo loves the ornateness of things, and then the Virgo wants to sort of make sure all of that ornateness, if that's a word, is sort of brought to life in the most meticulous way possible. And every detail, every sort of mark, every swirl, every color is just perfect. And there's definitely a time and a place for that. And I find a lot of value in that approach to things. I feel like it's definitely got me in a lot of ways to where I am right now, just in a bunch of different areas of my life, not necessarily just magically or professionally, but just, um, I value my attention to detail and my appreciation for, and what I'd argue is my sort of affinity for like aesthetics and details. Um, but sometimes it can bog you down, um, and it gets overwhelming and it freezes you, right? Like you're to the point where you don't want to do anything because you've overwhelmed yourself with the possibility of what you could do. Um, and so that's that. Also with me with like systems, I'm big on systems. Um, I think they're very helpful, but again, like those can also bog you down. Like when you get too, you sort of get into the weeds too much. Um, and everything just becomes so a system can become so intricate that it becomes like overly delicate, where if one thing is sort of if one factor changes, then it's like, oh my god, we have to throw the whole thing away because this didn't go exactly as planned or exactly how it was supposed to go based on this book or based on this like 5-page manifesto that I wrote. And you know just keep it simple, go with the flow, being a bit more spontaneous and open to improv. um, is like my biggest struggle. I'm working on it, and I think I'm making progress, but it's definitely something I'm actively working on.
Do you like Rococo design?
I do. I do. I love Rococo. I love like a minimal moment,
When
but
you
I
said
I
it, when you
love
said Leo, I was like, "Oh."
yeah, I love Rococo. I love very like ornate. I love like the ornate nature of like Gothic architecture. Looking at like old cathedrals. The church that I grew up in it is a Gothic cathedral. The building is so I grew up around like original stained glass, groin vaulted ceilings, like original woodwork, and I was never really paying attention. Not never, but I was rarely ever paying attention to the sermons. I was like counting the swirls in the chandeliers, or like looking at the color of the carpet and matching it to different things. You know, it was I like beauty. I love beauty.
When you started describing it, that's just what I saw in my head.
Yeah, yeah, very much that.
What would you say brings you the most joy?
Um, the fact that I'm at a point now where I don't okay, I love really like vivid confirmation of things. So I'm not at a point now where I find myself questioning the existence of magic or spirits, right? Like there was that period where in fact, I was an atheist for like 1.5 years, like in the middle of my practice. Um, I just sort of full blank slate, did a complete 180 because I was like, this, nope, none of this makes sense. Um, and then I was like, well, nope, never mind, because this is super intrinsic to who I am. And I just felt like a part of me was missing. Without that belief, I forget where I heard this, but I like to say that I didn't lose my faith, I just misplaced it. Um, and so like that's kind of what that period felt like for me. And it also felt like a moment of like recalibration, um, because I thought I had sort of shaken off so much of the religious dogma, the fear of hell and eternal damnation, and um, I hadn't. And that, like, my affinity for magic and my passion for magic and the occult was something I was always very afraid of growing up, because, being queer growing up in church, I always knew that like the anti-queer sentiments, I always knew that that was BS. There was some part of me that I was like, there is no way I'm going to go to hell because I'm gay. That just doesn't make any sense. But for some reason, I was petrified that like me being a quote unquote witch is what was going to do it. Right. Like I was going to get to the pearly gates and God was going to say, you like boys, that's cool. But that magic, burn, that really kept me up at night. And I feel like the atheism, it was kind of like an etch a sketch moment where I was able to just like shake my brain and be like, okay, I'm not afraid of that anymore. So now that I return to it, I can return to it with this renewed sense of like freedom and liberation from that fear. With all that said, even though like I do have this like unshakable belief in these concepts and these things, um, I love confirmation. Those moments where, and it could be something simple, like I mentioned mysticism and communion earlier, like just being in the presence of a spirit and you call their name and you feel them show up. I'm like, ugh, I love that. I love that because I'm like, you're here. You heard me and you came. Um, and that's just so powerful for me. And even like with the results oriented stuff, you do a spell and it works and you're like, yes, awesome, I love this, like that this really solidified something in me, or further solidified something in me. So I would say that's what brings me the most joy right now.
Well, the next question, you may have just answered it. Well, except that maybe not. Do you have any fear about magic? And if so, what is it?
Right now it's not a fear of anything magical, it's just like a fear of a potential trajectory of like my practice, and that's stagnancy. Um, I feel like I'm in a position now where where it's everything is always evolving, right? My cosmology is always shifting, and I'm always questioning things and adding things in and taking things out. And if I ever got to a point where I felt just uninspired, right? Because I love the act of inspiration or the process of inspiration more than I love the act of creation itself, right? Um, and so, like, I could go a while without creating anything, conjuring anything, working on anything specific. But if my brain ever got to a point where I wasn't actively thinking about it, that would kind of freak me out a bit. Like, oh, like what's wrong? Right? Like why am I not where's that spark? And so that's kind of what would scare me or does the possibility of that is what scares me.
Hmm. What is something you did early in your practice that you don't do anymore, and why don't you do it?
Overly gender everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was very much in that space of, and this is just like 2018, 2019, so not super long ago. I was in that space of like I want to be quote unquote one of the good men, right? Um, and so and I still do, right? Like I'm not saying like yes, all of a sudden I just want to be like super mean to like women and femme presenting people, but there was this period of like overcompensation where it's like and it was at the expense of the quote unquote or what would be sort of referred to as like the masculine aspects of things, right? So everything was like goddess this and goddess that, and it was always very superficial, right? The amount of pictures I drew of like divine feminine presences as of being like pregnant, just like reducing the feminine down to like motherhood. Not that there's anything wrong with motherhood, of course, but like that I was just sort of reducing everything down to that because that was the most like obvious thing or sort of way for me to lean into that current. In hindsight was kind of ridiculous. Um, and I'm glad I got away from that, especially as I've began to like queer my practice more, and the idea of gender became or has become more fluid and flexible for me. Like I identify as a cis man, but my relationship to gender is very different than what it was just 3 4 years ago. um so yeah, I'm that's what I used to do a lot, and I'm glad I didn't do it anymore because it was just very limiting to for me and for those who I would interact with.
I relate to that a lot.
Thank you.
Just about everything you said.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
What would you say is your favorite tool in your practice? And it does not have to be a physical object.
I would say it's my body, um, my whole body. One of my all-time favorite movies is the 2018 remake of Suspiria. And for those who aren't familiar, Suspiria, both the original and the remake, it's about a dance school in Berlin, or the remake takes place in Berlin, but they both take place in Germany. A dance school in Germany run by a coven of witches. And the original, it was a ballet school that's kind of where it ended, right? Like this dance school was just like a setting for the other shenanigans to happen, right? There was a lot of murder, a lot of intrigue, scandal, etc. Um, but the remake, the director Luca Guadagnino worked closely with the choreographer Damien Gillet, um, and they did this really fabulous thing where they made dance the ritual, right? Like dance was how the witches expressed themselves. And there's a beautiful, well, it's beautiful to me. It's very grotesque. There's this beautiful scene in the movie, spoilers for 2018 Suspiria, um, where the sort of head witch of the sort of head of the dance academy imbues the hands and the feet of the protagonist with their magic. And as she's dancing, there's a girl in the other room who the witches wanted to get rid of because they were scared that she was going to sort of blow their cover. And as this person is dancing, and it's a modern dance, so the remake, it's not ballet, it's modern dance, so it's very it's ugly in a lot of ways, right? It's very like Merce
Yeah.
Cunningham, yeah, and it's very visceral and very monstrous. And as she's dancing and contorting her body, I'm getting chills just talking about it. The person in the other room is like being like sort of bent out of shape, right? Like her jaw is being dislocated, her legs are sort of being cracked over her head remotely, and it's being done through the dance. And I remember seeing that for the first time in theaters, and I watch that movie often. My sister is kinda creeped out that it's one of my comfort movies. It's I and it I remember seeing that for the first time in 2018 in theaters, and just being it was a borderline sexual experience, um, just watching it, even though it was so grotesque, because I just I felt something come over my entire body as I was watching it, and it's funny because later on in the movie, the protagonist, her name is Susie. She's talking to the head of the dance school. Her name is Madame Blanc. She's played by Tilda Swinton, fabulous. And
Love.
yeah, she plays like three characters in the movie. It's amazing. And Madame Blanc is asking Susie like, you were a natural out there, right? Like, how did that feel? And she came from this Mennonite background, right? So this is all very new to her, with this sort of worldly, or at least we think it is. That's the twist. Ooh, watch it.
Oh no.
Um, you should watch it. Everyone should watch it. It's amazing. Um, but on a conscious level, this is all very new to her. And Susie answers. She's like, it felt animalistic. It felt like what I would imagine it would feel like to fuck. She's like, it feels like this is what I imagine it would feel like to fuck. And I'm like, yes, because that's what it felt like watching it. Like it felt so real and so tangible. And my body since then, and more now than in the past few years, for a number of reasons. And a lot of that has to go back to like my working with Mars a lot, and Mars being very much like of the body and of the blood, of the viscera. And yeah, let me stop before I go on because I could talk about Suspiria forever. Because I love that movie so much, and I know we'll be talking about influences later, but like Damien Gillet is amazing.
Okay, so I guess I'm gonna add that movie to my list because
Yes,
this is the 3rd time, and after 3, that's when I'm like, "Okay, now I have
yeah.
to."
Watch both. So like it's the original is a trilogy. It's like 1977 Suspiria, and then 1980 was Inferno, and then the last one from like 2011, Mother of Tears. It sucks, but just to finish the trilogy, you should watch it. And it's this whole mythos that they strung together, and then like I said, Luca Guadagnino sort of I refer to it as a remake just because that's what it is, but I lovingly refer to it as a cover. The score is by Tom York, and it's I refer to it as a cover because like a cover, like a good one at least, it has all of the same elements there, same lyrics, right? Same beats, same melody, but they put
It's
it's their own
theirs.
voice, it's theirs, right? New
Oh,
instruments,
I'm
new
excited
oh,
now.
it's so good. You have to watch it. I'm gonna watch it tonight. Oh, I'm so excited.
I love hearing about things that people are really into.
Yeah, yeah, I love it. I love passion. Apathy is like a huge,
Yeah.
for lack of a better phrasing, turn off for me,
Yeah,
and so
that's what I was gonna say.
yeah.
If you could only recommend one source of information, like a book, podcast, YouTube channel, whatever, to a new witch or new practitioner, what would it be and why?
Um, oof. So the book I chose is, and I kept it like on the technical end of things because I was like, maybe I should, be different and recommend like a novel or something. And you're like, oh, there are magical themes in that. But I'm
You
gonna go with
can.
like, yeah, I can't think of anything. So I'm gonna go with like the very obvious, like this is a book about witchcraft. Um, it's New World Witchery by Corey Thomas
Yes.
Hutchinson, and it's
Hell
so
yeah.
good. Yeah, it's amazing, and I'm still working my way through it. But like I mentioned earlier, like that North American folk magic approach to things, and he just does an amazing job at. And I think he just came out with a new book as well.
Mhm.
He does a really good job at respectfully, which I'm big on, respectfully sort of speaking about different cultures, right? Because he talks about hoodoo in this book, and I feel like it's done well. Um, yeah, and you just get ideas. It's very hands-on. It's not too theory heavy. It's not super like it's not a bunch of like dead recipes, right? It's work, it's folklore, it's sort of a larger concepts that you can sort of extrapolate and sort of pull information from and sort of weave your own practice together, that's actually informed by something historical and tangible and just cool. A lot of the stories in this book are just like really cool. Um, so yeah, and they also have, have a podcast of the same name, which I also recommend. So yeah.
Plus, almost, I think on every page, there are resources to check out.
Yeah, like it's
Love it.
one of those. I'm a big fan of if you are inspired by someone or influenced by someone to make it a point to look at their influences. Um, and he makes that very easy because you can see what he read and or sort of experienced to come to these conclusions. And so yeah, I love
Seconded a whole lot.
it.
Would you say that environment has shaped your practice? I don't know if you've lived anywhere else, but if you have, did it change as you move around? Did you take different things? And do you think it would be different if you lived somewhere else, like here where I live?
Yeah, I definitely think it would be different, just answering it backwards. I definitely think it would be different. I think I would adapt fairly well, but I've lived in Southeast Michigan my entire life, like the Metro Detroit area specifically. Now I'm sort of out of the Metro Detroit area, but I'm only like 30 minutes away from it. Um, I'm in Ypsilanti, and Michigan, we get all the seasons. Um, Sometimes seemingly out of order, but we get them, and you just learn. I feel like when you're from a place like Michigan, you your appreciation of the sea, and appreciation probably isn't the right word, but your relationship to, or your understanding of, that's what I'm looking for, your understanding of the seasons is a bit different because they can be so unpredictable, and you can't necessarily look to, and this is the same most places as well, right? I'm not saying that other places are like super rigid, but just from my experience in a place like Michigan, you can't really look to dates to sort of to sort of divide the year, right?
Mhm.
The equinoxes and the solstices on a practical level mean absolutely nothing to me because it could be like summer solstice or spring equinox or whatever, and then like it snows for 2 weeks into spring. So like that doesn't mean anything to me, right? It's sort of as far as my engagement with the landscape. And so I've learned to look down a lot, develop my own cues and my relationships to those cues. I remember this past fall going into winter, it was, I want to say like probably like mid to late October. Um, so, well before the winter solstice. And I remember being like, yeah, now it feels like winter now because I remember I was taking a walk and I looked down on the sidewalk and everything just had this gray overcast to it. Everything felt very Saturnian, very dry, very dark. And I saw these earthworms sort of wiggling around on the pavement. And they were, you see earthworms during the spring and the summer when it's warm and moist, and they're bright pink, sometimes like red, right? But these were like they were very pale, right? Because they were cold and they were dying. And I stopped and I looked at that and I'm like, yeah, this is winter, right? Like this is winter now. Um, the solstice isn't for a few weeks, a month or so, but like this is winter now, and I can sort of magically move into that wintry space, even though we're technically still in fall. Um, so yeah, that my environment plays a huge role, and especially with like foraging, I've incorporated foraging more into my practice. And so of course you have to be very aware of like when things are growing and where they're growing and stuff like that. And
It's interesting to think about that here because the growing seasons are different here.
yeah.
We kind of have 2 growing seasons, and winter is one of them, and summer
Oh.
is when everything's dead or
Oh.
nothing happens because it's so hot, it just fries everything. Yeah, our
Hmm.
growing season started in about September. It goes from September to now, kind of.
Oh, that's interesting. See, that would be such a shock for me. Like I said, I would adapt after a little while, but yeah, that would be. I'm so used to Michigan,
Mhm.
the cycles of Michigan, that yeah, anything else would be like if I lived somewhere like because one day I would like to move to the South, and if I moved somewhere that was like tropical, that would be that would be a big adjustment for me.
Man, Florida, where it seems like you can get everything you want all the time
Yeah, I know quite a
'cause
few
they have
people who live
water.
in Florida. Yeah, and I'm like, wow, that's just year-round access to not year-round because like they have their cycles and things die off and stuff like that. But yeah, just it will be very different than what I'm used
Me too.
to.
It's still interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Would you say that you have, like, I feel like everything is pretty cyclical, and sometimes there's a low period. Do you
Mhm.
do anything to pull yourself out of it, or do you just sort of accept that it's part of the cycle and just sludge through?
It's like a little bit of both. Like I accept it. Um, I'm big on sort of anti-spiritual bypassing. If you're depressed, there isn't a spell to cure depression. Um, unfortunately, at least not one that I'm aware of, or have tried. And so you're acknowledging your humanity in that moment, right? And sort of acknowledging the sort of mundane things that you can do to sort of maybe get you out of it, but if not that, then sort of help you cope. And to me, it looks a lot like those sort of everyday tasks, right? Being very cognizant of smell, right? If I know I'm feeling a bit down, um, I want my space to smell sweet. So I'm going to burn some vanilla incense or some lavender or something like that. Or I'm going to, you know, if I have the capacity, like deep clean my bathroom and take a bath so that I can sort of be in a space that smells good and is clean. I'm going to do my laundry. And again, this is all contingent on what I have the space for in that
Mhm.
moment, right? And it's you want to acknowledge your humanity, but I also don't want to personally, I don't want to allow myself to like get too deep into something to the point where I'm paralyzed. It happens, regardless of what I would want. It happens. Um, but that's how I tend to sort of work my way through that is sort of bringing stuff back down to earth. Um, it's if I'm stressed out or anxious about something, and you pair that with the depressive episodes, um, I'm not going to be pulling too many cards on things or divining too much because the last thing I need to see when I'm stressed out about finances is, the Two of Pentacles and the Tower. I'm like, I did not need to see that right now. That was not something so that just sent me down a deeper spiral. And so it's bringing stuff back down to earth, making things. I would say my practice is already quite tangible, but making them even more so. Getting outside, going outside if I can, feeling the sun, the air, smelling the horrible Bradford pear trees. Um,
Still, they still have those
they
there?
still have them everywhere, and
Ugh.
I forget about them every year. And I'm like, why does it smell like baby gravy outside?
Funk.
And it's it's the pear trees.
Mm. Why?
It's the pear trees. But they ground me because I'm like, I'm alive and my nose works, so I guess I'm grateful for that.
Grudgingly. What is something you wish was discussed more in, I'm gonna call it the witch community?
Yeah. I have 3 things, they're all pretty brief. 1, minding your own business.
Good
Um,
lord, yes.
I like to say that, what someone does at the privacy of their own altar is none of my business. Obviously, if someone is publicly proclaiming themselves to be like a leader or an authority in a tradition that isn't theirs, or they are sharing sort of unsafe information, right? You're sort of encouraging people to blend poisonous plants into their smoothies to open up their third eye. I'm like, no, 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 no. Let's not do that, right? Like this person is they don't know what they're talking about, right? But if someone is like, I want to put Santa Muerte next to Hecate, I'm like, okay, and I promise you, you're not going to get any pushback from me because I don't care. It doesn't affect me. Um, so that's that. Taking accountability for your own education. Um, and that includes and this is a plug, that includes paying your
Yes.
practitioners.
Yes.
I offer a consultation service, right? It's basically just like office hours. You can pay me for an hour or more to just you bring a topic to me. And if I'm qualified to talk about it, I will let you know if I'm not ahead of time. But if I'm qualified to talk about it, we can sit and talk about it. I'll give you all the books, the we can, we can do all that, right? And I make this service known, right? I publicize it. Yet there are people who will slide into my DMs and tell you leave a three because Instagram will like cut you off after a certain point, like, hey, this message is too long. They will send me three of those outlining a dream that they had or something that they're experiencing. And they're like, oh, what do you think about this? Okay, well, here's the link,
Mm,
here's the
sweet
booking link.
dream.
You know what I'm saying? Like, and we could discuss that, and I don't hear anything, right? And I'm like, "Oh, yeah." I'm not trying to police people's pockets, I'm not interested in that, but also
Your
you
time is still
your
valuable.
time
You
my
can't get
time
that
is
time back.
valuable. Exactly. And also, that's a different conversation, but, yeah, taking accountability for your own education, and that includes, budgeting for it, just to be frank, um so
If
there's
it's
there's
not
that.
important enough for you to pay for it, why is it important to me?
Exactly. I look, and here's the thing. I wish I that we all lived, not just me, that we all lived in a society where it would be economical for me to like center an entire business around like bartering. I would love to
Mhm.
introduce bartering or just being able to do stuff for free, but I can't, right? I have bills to pay. And
Yeah, I can't pay
unfortunately,
my electricity with a crystal
with a crystal or with you just sending me
or
an email
another
telling me
tarot.
how much exactly. And it's so there's that element. Um yeah, taking accountability for your own education. And then the final thing is make, and I'm going to use the word witchcraft just as a umbrella term, make witchcraft dirty again. Um, bring back the filth, the blood, the bodily fluids, the bones, the meat, all of that. Bring all of that back. The sex, the monstrousness of it all. Um, bring all of that back. In the name of speaking about running a business. I understand the impulse to sanitize what you do, and obviously everything that you do does not need to be publicized. Some of it might be not legal, right? Um, because there are definitely elements of sneaking into places and digging things up. So you don't want to go on Instagram like this. Yes, I'm grave robbing today, but it's like um, so like you don't want to do that. And also just there's a decorum to social media. Like I'm not going to post like a bloody. I'm not going to post like roadkill without like a trigger warning or something because no one wants to see that just scrolling through their feed at 9 in the morning. But um so yeah, I get needing to sort of tone things down and sanitize things for the sake of an algorithm, but even then, right? Like there, look, there is these things are a part of this work, regardless of what tradition you're in. You don't have to use it if you don't want to touch bones or work with urine or spit or blood or semen or what. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. Again, what you do at the privacy of your own altar is none of my business. Or and same thing goes for what you don't do. I don't care. But don't judge me when I do, right? Um, and I say when as opposed to if because it will happen. It happens often, and it will continue to happen because it's a part of the work that I do, and it's again, it's how I ground myself. You know, if we're supposed to be these magical practitioners, and we're so in touch with nature, and we're embodying these different aspects of nature, well, nature is filthy,
Yeah,
right?
it's not all pink and glitter.
Exactly. It's definitely not glitter. So please stop
Seriously.
using
Gross.
glitter, but, just putting that out there, but it can be filthy. One of my favorite things about summer, it's starting to warm up. It's 53 degrees here today, but like I said, a week or so ago, it was like 80 consistently, and I'm like, "Oh, okay, I'm not a huge fan of that aspect of it," but one thing I did enjoy or do enjoy about this hot weather is that, like, faint pungency that's in the air from the smell of, like, small carcasses decaying. Right? Like, the stuff
Mhm.
that is, like, kind of preserved in the winter and the fall, right? Because it's cooler out, um, but, like, that roadkill now or that bird that died off on the side of the trail or that squirrel or whatever, that's gonna start to stink when it's, like, 80 degrees outside, and it starts to decompose, and I kinda like that. Um, I like being outside and smelling that because it's like that those signs of death are also signs of life as far as I'm concerned. And that's where the power is. Um, yeah. So those are things I wish was discussed more.
That yeah, I love it. Okay, good. Do you ever work with other magical practitioners?
I have. I don't often. Um, I'm not opposed to doing it again, but I'm a Virgo rising and my Mercury is in Virgo. So I'm very meticulous about how I think things should be. And when I bring something to a group, um, I sometimes I, I've been told, and lovingly, that someone a friend of mine once referred to me as like the secretary of the abyss, right? Because I love a good spreadsheet. I love like I love cataloging things and just making sense of stuff, right? And so if I do bring a specific like ritual proposal, I'm speaking about it as if it's like a grant, to a group. It's just that. It's a proposal, right? And I've already taken the time to like map out, okay, here's when we're going to do it, what we're going to need, how we're going to do it, blah, 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 blah. And sometimes when like other people rightfully are like a bit more into improv or maybe a bit more chaotic in their approaches, it kind of stresses me out a bit. Because my secretary nature, my sort of administrative nature just gets shaken up. And again, I'm working on that, but that's why I don't do it as much as I used to because nothing gets me out. It gets me sort of out of the sort of magical headspace more than like, why is your candle shorter than mine? Like, where did you get your candle? I brought enough for everyone. Why? Like,
What is this?
where did you bring that from? Um, where's your pre-blended, incense blend that I made for you? I made enough for everyone. I gave everyone an ounce baggie. Like, what's going on? And so
I
it's
feel this so hard.
it's like, what is happening? You're throwing me off.
Yes,
Yeah. So I always end up enjoying myself. That's the important part. But
that's good.
the leading up to the enjoyment, it's like pulling my hair out.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly why I don't. Because I'm a control freak. I'm
Yeah.
not gonna even
Yeah,
put it
yeah.
any other way. I'm a control freak, I'm a
Yeah.
micromanager, and if your candle that I gave you, if it's not the candle I gave you, I'm gonna have a conniption.
Yeah. I'm a recovering perfectionist. I'm a recovering
Yes.
perfectionist.
Who would you say are the 3 big who or what are the 3 biggest influences on your practice, and can you let them know how they influenced you?
Yes. So the first one is long dead, so that would require some necromancy. But William Blake, um, William Blake introduced me in college to the world of like mystical poetry. I was already familiar with romanticism and stuff like that, but William Blake specifically and his relationship to spirits and how unapologetic he was about it. Because the thing that I wanted to go into academia originally, slight tangent, um, but the thing that kept me from doing it was how, again, like how materialist it all, like a lot of it is, like even within the humanities, like the spaces where you would assume people would be a bit more open to magic and spirituality and stuff like that, like they were still quite rigid sometimes. And I would find myself like going back and forth with my professors, like, oh, I think this piece of art is like magical in nature. And they're like, I don't think so. I'm like, dude, it's literally a conjuration. Like, what are you so afraid? I know you don't want to, be the weird one amongst your super professional academic peers, but like this person, they're literally referencing like a grimoire. What are you confused about? But I digress. Um, William Blake, because it was so undeniable. Like you can't read William Blake and interpret it in any other way other than something that is deeply informed by someone's like religious and spiritual experiences, right? Um, so I love William Blake for that. Um, Damien Gillet, the choreographer, um, for really exposing me to that like dance as ritual, the sensuality of movements. Um, there's a specific dance, I talked about Suspiria, so like watch that to get an idea of what I'm saying. But if you're not ready to carve out like 2.5 to 3 hours of your day, there is a dance that he choreographed. It's on YouTube. I'm terrible at French, but it's like Livocation, like, so I guess French for like the evocation. And the dance was done surrounded by, I think it was in a museum, surrounded by these like ancient Mesopotamian sculptures.
Ooh.
Um, and so like that's the backdrop, and it's so animalistic. There's a lot of grunting and stomping and growling and it's beautiful. Um, and so I would recommend everyone go watch that. Um, yeah, so like Damien Gillet, if you're listening, thank you. And then also Guillermo del Toro. I seeing Hellboy in theaters for the first time. Again, growing up very weird, very religious family, couldn't watch The Exorcist, but like Hellboy, absolutely. Um, Seeing that for the first time was such a formative experience for me. Um, and it's what exposed me to Guillermo del Toro's work. I even have like the tarot deck, um, the Guillermo del Toro tarot deck that I really love. Um, but there was this like that intersection of like monstrosity and whimsicality, right? Like everything he everything had this like fairy tale element to it. And he strikes me as this person who takes what he does very seriously, but he doesn't take himself too seriously, right? There's a sense of humor that he infuses into everything that he does, and I appreciate that, and that's something that I really seek to embody. Um, because I acknowledge that like magic is kind of silly, right? Like we're talking to plants and, you know,
Asking them to do
asking
something
them to do
for us.
something for us. And like it's kind of silly. It's in that the silliness doesn't make it any less powerful or potent, but like you can't be so in your own head of like, I'm going to be super serious. It's like you can banish spirits by like banging pots and pans in corners of your home, right? Like that's kind of strange, right? Um, but that's how it works, right? And that's the beauty of it. And I just love that he's not afraid to go there, that he's not afraid to um, lean into the horror elements of things while still being open to humor and levity. So those are my three.
Nice. What words of wisdom do you have for a new practitioner?
I have a few. So the first one, and this traces back. sort of connects to like the imposter syndrome. You have to actually do work. um, all the books, classes, YouTube videos in the world, that's not you practicing. It just isn't. It's good to have that information, but and you don't have to, right? I feel like there's this confusion where people are like, oh, like I engage with witchcraft an academic or a theoretical perspective, therefore I am a witch or therefore I am a practitioner. And it's like, no, you're just an occultist. And I don't mean just in a derogatory way, but you don't practice, right? I can read all the anatomy and physiology books I want, but if I try to go walk into, my closest physical therapy clinic, I'm like, "Hey, I'm here to work." They'll be like, excuse me, do you have any experience?" Right? Like, so it's the same thing. So actually do work. It's the only way that you're going to get better at it and also deepen your confidence in what you're doing. And same thing goes for the failures. Those failures are also going to deepen your confidence. Um, I'm also a big fan of people, I'm unverified personal gnosis is definitely a thing. There are going to be things that certain people do. I know there are things that I do that are quote unquote traditionally seen as like things that shouldn't work, right? But they work for me, and that's the relationship that I have with those spirits. So that aside, that sort of caveat aside, make sure what you're doing makes sense, especially from like a folk magic perspective, since a lot of folk magic tends to be very practical and oftentimes very literal, right? Like you want to bind something, you tie it up. You want to destroy something, you physically break it. You want to, uh, banish something, you throw it out your window, right? Like it's very like a very the thread between the action and the magic is very clear a lot of times. Sometimes it isn't, but more often than not, it is, right? And sometimes I'll be scrolling through TikTok, which I like to avoid doing, but dopamine and or serotonin, whatever the chemical is, and I'll see things, and it's not presented as personal gnosis. It's presented as like principle, like this is how this works, right? And I'm like, that makes no sense whatsoever. They're like, I want to do a fast sweetening spell, so I'm going to fill a jar up with honey and put stuff in it. Well, does honey move very fast? No. So why would you use honey to do something quick? Now, if you wanted to use that honey to get something to stick, or if you wanted to sort of prolong something, right? For example, when I was at my previous job during quarantine, I had the privilege of being able to work from home, but people were still in the company being like, what's the word, furloughed every once in a while.
Yeah.
And thankfully, I never was, and I think it was because of this work that I did where I was like, "Okay, I'm already here, I have the job," right? So I don't need to do anything quickly, because I have it, but I do want this job to stick. So I'm gonna put my business card along with some other herbs and money and stuff like that in this jar with honey, because honey, again, it's an adhesive, or it can act as an adhesive. I want to stick to this job, right? Something like that. Like the work has to, I'm not going to say it has to make sense. In my opinion, the work should make sense in very literal ways like that. I'm all for symbolism. I'm all for abstractions. But if we're talking about a practice that's scalable, something that's rooted in like transferable principles, um, approaching it in a very literal way like that to me helps. Same thing when you see people doing like, and no offense to anyone who does this stuff, again, if it works for you, but like, what's a banishing jar? If you're trying to get rid of something, why are you locking it up in a jar and keeping it in your home? It's like
I don't know.
stuff
I
like,
haven't heard of that.
oh, I'm gonna banish this. I'm gonna put this in a jar. Oh, that literally does not make any sense. Now, if you're gonna put it in a jar and then
Get rid of it.
go chuck
Take
it
it to
somewhere.
McDonald's and put it in the trash can
Exactly, that's different, but, like, it's just sitting in your home.
in her
You're
fridge.
containing it, or your freezer, right, you're containing it, but you're not banishing it. That's a totally different working, a valid working, an effective one, but it's different. And then the final thing, before I get down off my soapbox, is Um, look down, safely, of course, but like look down, both literally and figuratively speaking. Don't be so, what's the saying? Don't be so heavenly minded that you are of no earthly good. Um, communion with these greater powers. I'm trying to get away from using the term higher power, but these greater powers is awesome, right? Being able to sort of look up to the heavens and see all this stuff, that's awesome. But n- notice the earthworms, notice the plants budding up at the beginning of spring or whenever your growing season is, right? Um, notice those subtle things, and look down, figuratively speaking, also could just be could also just reference just being more aware of your surroundings. um Noticing that, like, it's been a while since I've heard the morning doves, what's going on, right? Or what's that smell? I walk outside, it smells different. Oh, okay, those trees must be blooming, stuff like that, being very aware of your surroundings. um I'm an animist. I identify as an animist. And so to be in right relationship with my surroundings involves being aware of them, and acknowledging their existence. Um, and yeah, so those are my three things. So just to someone just starting out.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
After answering all these questions, who do you think would be an interesting guest to hear their answers? Even the weird Patreon ones.
Yeah, so it's a duo. The Satyrs and Sinners podcast. Um, I was on there not too long ago, and it's Justify and Kane. Um, they're also on Instagram, and I just like their energy and their attitudes. There's this sort of unapologetic feistiness to their approach and the way they sort of express themselves. And I just like their perspectives on things. Um, Justify is approaching things from like more of like a traditional witchcraft perspective, and then you have Kane, who is a horror writer, by the way, and I believe they practice witchcraft, but they also infuse it with their sort of like Caribbean roots, and so there's a lot of like that going on in the background, and that those sort of cultural elements. Um, and I just think it would be interesting to hear one or both of them answer these questions.
Cool. Okay. It'll go on my list. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that I didn't ask, or did you have any questions for me?
Um, I don't have any questions. I just have like some announcements. I like to call them church announcements.
Yes,
When
do
I'm
it.
um, I'm super excited. This is my first lecture not hosted by me. I'll be lecturing at Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival this year in
Yee.
August. I'll be doing a lecture. It's called the Gold and Scarlet God, exploring the benefic and malefic element or aspects of the solar current. Um, and it's exactly that, just talking about solar magic and the sort of constructive and destructive aspects of the sun, magically speaking, and looking at like folklore and mythology to sort of help sort of color in those different aspects. Um, and then if you're in the Southeast Michigan area, I'll be giving a lecture at a local shop, Even Stars Chalice, in June on planetary magic. So feel free to follow me to sort of be made aware when the date is released, and we might also be doing, depending on demand, like a remote or like an online version. So even if you're not in Michigan, you might be able to tune in eventually. Um, yeah. Then there's just like my Patreon where I do like readings, monthly readings. I have like tiers on my Patreon where people can get like discounted monthly readings, and where I just go in there and talk crap and go on sort of like middle of the night magical musings where I'm just screaming into my phone and like, what if we what about this and what about that? And everyone's like, yeah, I like that. I'm like, great. So that's it.
Can you
Mm.
refresh us on where to find you?
Yes. Everywhere at Porous Palms. So I have like, my website, porousPalms.com. That's also where I host my apothecary offerings through the same website. So I have like incense and oils and stuff like that. Um, And then there's Instagram at Porous Palms, and then patreon.com/porous palms, POROUSPALMS. And yeah.
Nice. So at the end, I ask two things of my guests. Number one, please recommend something to the listeners. It does not have to be witch or it doesn't, it can be anything.
Suspiria. Suspiria. Um, it's one of those. It's definitely an art house film, right? It's one of those. Um, so if you know, I totally understand if, and I don't mean this in like a pretentious way, but I just get like some people just don't like that stuff, right? They want like a linear narrative, and that's perfectly fine. I want that most of the time. But if you're willing to like sit down and like step outside of your comfort zone maybe and sort of appreciate something else like 2018 Suspiria, please go watch it and then feel free to flood my inbox telling me how great of a recommendation it was. I could go on about it forever. um, yeah, I love it so much. So yeah, Suspiria.
Okay, last thing. Would you please tell me a story? I would love it if it was something like I call it gathering stories where
Hmm.
you're at a family reunion or you're around a campfire or you and a bunch of friends that you haven't seen in a long time, but everybody knows the same stories. And somebody says, remember when? And then everybody knows the story, but you tell it anyway.
Okay, so this one is kind of spooky. So I, for context, my one of my I would say I was in like middle school, like late middle school, going into high school. It had to have been eighth grade because I was living in Dearborn at the time. I got really into astral projection and lucid dreaming. Um, that was just like a fixation of mine. I was the person going to sleep with like the binaural beats playing in their headphones and doing the visualization exercises and of the silver cord running from my belly button out into the astral plane and all that other stuff. And I had some really interesting experiences, sort of sort of during those moments, during those exercises. But fast forward to like a year and a half ago, um, I don't do those exercises, at least not intentionally, as much as I used to, if at all. But every once in a while, I still find myself having like one of those out of body experiences, um, where I quote unquote wake up, but I'm not fully present in the physical world. I'm definitely sort of in some in between space, some liminal space. Um, so, like I said, a year and a half ago, yeah, I set up a temporary altar, an abolitionist altar. Um, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Nat Turner, Frederick Douglass, all those people, and it was sitting on my bookshelf, and which I'm looking at right now. So it's like sitting at the very front of my living room, and then on the opposite side of my apartment, I have my ancestor altar, and
So they face one another?
they roughly,
Okay. I'm
and
trying to get it in my head.
yeah, it's and so like so the layout of my apartment, like so it's a one bedroom apartment. I have like the kitchen is sort of like it has like a breakfast counter that looks out into the living room. So you can see, into the living room from the kitchen. And the ancestor altar is or was at the time next to the kitchen, like in the dining area. Um, and then the bookshelf you can see as soon as you walk in. So they're kind of like at a right angle from one another, perpendicular, is
Okay.
that the word? Um, yeah. And so I doze off one day or one night, and I quote unquote wake up, and I hear this rustling sound. Now I've come to recognize when I'm having sort of like a lucid dreaming experience because of how things look. Everything looks the same, except there's this like tint over everything, almost as if I'm wearing like sunglasses, right? There's like this like navy blue tint over everything. Um, And I don't always realize that immediately, especially if you wake up to a jarring experience. You might not be in the most logical headspace, like, "Oh, this isn't not that it isn't real, but this isn't physical," right?
Mhm.
You're kind of just like, "Oh, what's happening?" And so I wake up, I open my eyes, and I hear this rustling sound. And it sounds like at first, it sounds like someone's carrying like grocery bags. Not unheard of. I live in an apartment. There's a hallway right outside of my front door. Someone could have just been walking groceries to their apartment, whatever. And that's where it sounded like it was coming from at first. Like it was coming from outside. And so I'm like, okay, no big deal. Until it sounded like it was coming from inside of my apartment. And so I'm like, uh-oh, someone's in here, right? And I like to joke that I'm more scared of people than I am of spirits because you can banish a spirit, you cannot banish a person.
Mhm.
So I'm freaking out at first because I'm like, there's someone in my apartment. And so I sort of Pink Panther style tiptoe out of my bedroom and I look out the peephole of my front door, which is directly next to my kitchen. And at this point, I can still hear the rustling sound, but it's sort of coming from everywhere all at once. I can't pinpoint where it's coming from. And then all of a sudden, as I'm looking through my peephole, my back facing the abolitionist altar, the sound focuses to behind me. So now it's like distinctly coming from behind me. And so I spin around and I can see through the like breakfast nook window out into the living room. I see clear as day this white specter sort of sneaking from the abolitionist altar to the direction of my ancestor altar. And it was so vivid. Prior to that point, it had been years since I had seen a spirit in such like a clear way, right? And it made sense that the rustling sound was the sound of them moving through grass or like some like foliage. And I was like, okay, this is someone who was enslaved and they're like escaping enslavement. And so we made eye contact. They saw me, I saw them. They took off running. And at this point, it didn't fully register in that split second. It didn't fully register that this wasn't a physical person. So my brain is still in like fight or flight mode because I'm like, someone somehow broke into my sixth floor apartment. Because my door is locked, the little chain is still on, so I doubt they broke in and then locked up behind themselves. Um, and so they must have come in through the window. I don't know how they did that. So I freak out. I sort of push myself. I sort of fall back into the wall out of shock until I see them run into the wall and through the wall that my ancestor altar is placed in. I hope the visuals are making sense.
Mhm.
So I'm like, oh, okay, there's a connection there. I haven't done any work, admittedly, to sort of see what that connection could be, but that really startled me in that moment. I'm like, oh, okay, there's a spirit moving from that abolitionist space over to my ancestor space, and it seems like they were running away from something or someone, and I startled them. It's almost as if I was witnessing. I grew up watching like Ghost Adventures, and I remember like those ghost hunting shows, and they would talk a lot about the two different types of hauntings, like intelligent versus residual hauntings.
Mhm.
And the intelligent hauntings being like a spirit sort of just like living its life in the spirit world, like they're sort of living in real time. And then a residual haunting is like a tape recorder on loop. Like the spirit kind of just like goes through the same motions over and over and over again because they don't realize that they don't have to anymore. And that's what this felt like. Because there was objectively no reason for that spirit to be afraid of me and to see me, but it was almost as if like the trauma that they experienced was still in them in spirit form. And so the fact that they had been perceived, it startled them and they sort of ran away from me. So that's my lucid dreaming story.
That makes me sad.
Yeah, it was scary at first, but then I was like, oh darn, like that was I startled them. And the rustling sound, I'm like, yeah, that was the sound of like dried foliage that they were sort of rustling through. Um, yeah, a roller coaster of emotions with that one.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the story
Absolutely.
and for being
Sure.
on the show.
Thank you for having me. I had a very good time.
Yay! And thanks again, and I will see you over on Instagram. Bye.
Goodbye.
So, David, welcome to Patreon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Definitely helped because I wouldn't have been able to swallow those. Because the interesting thing
No.
about scorpions, or at least these particular ones, they don't disintegrate upon chewing, they just flatten.
Oh.
And so you take that initial bite and like all the
Because
gut,
it's like
yeah,
exoskeleton.
yeah, the guts just.
To hear more of the Patreon episode, head over to patreon.com/cleverkimscurios for a free 7-day trial. The monthly magic tier will give you access to the monthly magic Marco Polo group, the private Patreon Facebook group, access to the written monthly spells, and more. There are also tiers with just digital content, or you can get spell boxes, intentional handcrafted jewelry that I make especially for witches, and there's even a crystal tier. Check it out at patreon.com/cleverkimscurios. Thanks for listening to this episode of Your Average Witch. You can find us all around the internet on Instagram at Your Average Witch Podcast, Facebook at facebook.com/groups/hivehouse, at youraveragewitch.com, and at your favorite podcast service. Want to help the podcast grow? Leave a review. You can review us on Amazon and Apple Podcasts, and now you can rate us on Spotify. If you'd like to recommend someone for the podcast, like to be on it yourself, or if you'd like to advertise on the podcast, send an email to youraveragewitchpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next Tuesday.